In HL7 FHIR applications, OAuth is the industry standard mechanism for secure authorization. In this video, you will see how to set up OAuth with an InterSystems FHIR Server and why a token might be rejected. We'll use Auth0 as an example authorization server, but you can use many different providers for a scenario like this one. When a request reaches your FHIR server with a token, the server first verifies that the token is properly signed and has not expired. It then evaluates 3 additional elements that determine whether the request is authorized: the issuer, the audience, and the scope. The issuer must match a trusted authorization server, and the audience must exactly match the FHIR endpoint. In addition, the scope must authorize the requested interaction. If any of these checks fails, the request fails, even if the token itself is valid from the authorization server's perspective. Let's consider a simple scenario. Suppose we're building a backend analytics service that needs read access to patient data in our FHIR repository. To support that, we'll configure both the authorization server and the FHIR server. In Auth0, we create an API whose identifier matches the full FHIR endpoint URL. That identifier value becomes the audience claim in the token and must exactly match the FHIR endpoint URL when the token reaches the FHIR server. We then define available scopes for that API, such as a system-level or patient-level scope. These define what the client or user is allowed to request, but they are ultimately enforced by the FHIR server. Now let's configure the FHIR server as the resource server. To begin, navigate to Security Configuration in the FHIR server and create a new OAuth configuration. Enter the issuer endpoint of the authorization server, in this case, the Auth0 server. When we click Discover, the FHIR server retrieves the authorization server metadata and signing keys. Next, we'll manually register the authorization server using the relevant information. This allows the FHIR server to validate incoming tokens and confirm they were issued by the trusted server. After saving this configuration, we can associate it with the FHIR repository in the authorization settings. This tells the FHIR server to enforce OAuth validation for requests to this repository. With both sides configured, our backend service can now request a token using the client credentials flow. The request includes the client ID and secret, the audience matching the FHIR endpoint, and the scope of access to the FHIR resources it is requesting. The authorization server returns an access token. If we decode the token, we see the issuer, audience, and scope claims. If those values are correct, we can send this token to the FHIR server. This token has a system-level, read-only scope, meaning it is requesting read access to the full set of patient resources matching our query. Let's try calling the FHIR server using this token. As you can see, the full set of 36 patient resources is returned, including both conditions and observations. Now, let's send the same request again, this time using a token with a more restrictive scope that only allows us to see conditions. This token is also valid. The issuer matches, the audience matches, and the scope is permitted. This time, however, the results are filtered based on the scope in the token. Only 23 resources are returned, all of which are conditions. As you can see, the scope determines not only whether the request is allowed, but which resources are returned. If you receive a 401 unauthorized error, the token likely failed issuer or audience validation. If you receive a 403 forbidden error, the requested interaction was not authorized under the provided scope, despite the token being valid. To recap, the FHIR server validates the issuer, the audience, and the scope of an incoming request. A token can be properly signed and unexpired, yet still be rejected if those elements don't align. Be sure to configure your authorization server carefully, register it correctly on the FHIR server, and define scopes that match your access requirements.